male, 3/16/67. Doesn't have any ID on him. 34, 13, 52. Come on, dude. Man, you better stop.
Dug my little hole in my prayer. Put them together. They needed to be together.
This is one of the most, if not the most, heinous, atrocious, and cruel case that I've been involved with in my 24 years as a district attorney.
I was also occasionally stepping outside, helping them look for the girl. Acting like I was all concerned about her missing.
When did you first notice they were looking for her?
Pretty much right after I killed her.
What's up, man? You alright?
Yeah.
What you doing out here this late?
Walking home.
Walking home? You break down?
No, just got mad.
You got an ID on you?
No.
What's your name, man?
David?
Hang out, okay? Don't go anywhere. Come on, dude. Man, you better stop.
Friends describe Lisa Underwood as a super responsible mom and businesswoman. She lives with her 7-year-old son, Jaden, in North Fort Worth.
We called hospitals before we called the police because she is 7 months pregnant.
Lisa's 2002 Dodge Durango is also missing.
We are talking to a number of people, many of which are very close to Miss Underwood.
And we started talking, and you agreed to talk to us. You came here on your own, correct?
Yeah.
You're not in handcuffs, you're not under arrest. You dated Lisa for some time, I think, a little bit, or what?
I dated her, I think we went on actually 2 dates.
You were dating somebody else at the same time?
I was dating a few people. I kind of made a joke out of it, well, my buffet line. And because I was dating so many girls.
Someone laughing while his ex-girlfriend is missing might feel really cold and callous and unemotional.
And you ended up marrying one of those people?
Yes.
What's her name?
Trish.
It's really striking that he's comparing women to a buffet line when he's being investigated for a potential double homicide.
He objectifies them. He describes them as something to be consumed cheaply.
Did Lisa tell you that that child was yours?
At one time, yes.
So he was married, and he was having an affair with Lisa. But just lying doesn't make you a psychopath. It makes you a liar.
I went to Ron's house.
Do you know about what time you left? Close?
o'clock or so. Ron thought it was around 3 o'clock or so.
Steve, we talked just a second ago about you being stopped by an officer up in Denton County. How did you get up there? Tell me what happened there.
I was driving my truck. I broke down. I was walking towards service road, and he come up and put his lights on me.
What name did you give him?
I didn't give him my name.
Why?
Because I was mad at him. I felt like he was harassing me because I was just walking. I wasn't doing nothing wrong.
And what did you do when he was in his car?
I ran
Okay. Where did you run to?
through a field towards the truck.
One of the traits of psychopathy is grandiosity. And it seems he perceives himself to be intellectually superior and can maybe get around whatever it is they're trying to get at.
The reason why I didn't say nothing about the police because I know I'd get in trouble for doing what I did.
Not to get in trouble for murder, Steve. Okay, where'd you run to?
Towards the truck. I was calling Ron and trying to find out he was trying to find me where I was at.
So you're saying that Ron came out there?
Yes.
Dodd said he got a call from Barbie saying he'd run out of gas. Dodd took the gas to Barbie on Farm Road 407. He said once there, Barbie opened the back of a blue SUV and that Dodd saw the bodies of a woman and child in the back.
Not to get in trouble for murder, Steve.
I did not do
I
that.
think you did something to her. And if you don't tell us, we have no choice but to put you in.
No, that upsets me that you're sitting there accusing me of this. Because I know I didn't do this.
Steve, maybe it was something like,
You think about this.
It wasn't nothing.
maybe it was something that you got in the car and with her and you went somewhere and something happened.
No.
They're letting him know they think he killed her. And for someone to go, well, that's very upsetting, or that upsets me.
No, that upsets me.
It could be a sign of shallow affect. But if it's something quite serious, like a murder, we would expect to see a greater expression of anger or sadness.
Steve, you asked me to stop the tape a minute ago, is that correct?
Yeah.
Ron took you to her house that night? About what time? After 10? After 11?
Maybe around 10 o'clock. She kept throwing up everything about insurance, child support, and telling Trish.
And telling Trish what specifically?
I don't know what she was going to say.
It's something to ruin your marriage.
Yes.
So somehow, during this argument, you killed her. I can hear you.
Yes. I was wrestling around and I was holding her down. And she stopped moving.
She had broken ribs and lots of damage to and around her face, which meant that he had to have been either kneeling on top of her or hitting her. She had multiple bruises. So this felt superficial to me. I didn't feel like it was a genuine display of emotional distress about a victim.
I just put my hand over his mouth, screaming. He
you tried to clean up, there was blood there?
My nose was bleeding. Hers.
Hers? What about the boy?
There was no blood from him. I hadn't hurt him. I just closed his mouth.
To say I didn't hurt him, I just closed his mouth. He's crying, sobbing, almost as if he pitied himself in this terrible situation he was in, rather than the situation that he voluntarily entered into.
He's someone who feels a lot of different emotions. He feels guilt, he feels shame, he feels rage, although we don't see the rage. He feels abandoned. He feels he's intensely looking for affection and attachment. All of these are not really consistent with a full-blown psychopath. He might have what we call borderline personality organization, not even disorder. He cycles through emotions strongly. He's very attached to relationships. He feels abandoned and empty when he's not in a relationship. He is not able to regulate his feelings, his intense feelings of love and shame and rage, and so closer to borderline personality.
You drove him up north?
Yes. Ron brought me a shovel. Dug my little hole. In my prayer.
In a wooded area, investigators finally made the discovery.
We know that the grave contains the bodies of a female and a male consistent with the ages of Lisa Underwood and her son Jaden.
There's a lot of focus on how his life is ruined, how he's going to go to jail for a long time, and how his life is over, which I think also exemplifies that callous lack of empathy that is seen in psychopaths. And I hear so much more of his pitifulness and poor me than I see any genuine expression of remorse.
Days of searching for 10-year-old Jamie Rose Boland came to a devastating end Friday afternoon here in the town of Purcell, Oklahoma.
This is one of the most, if not the most, heinous, atrocious, and cruel case that I've been involved with in my 24 years as a district attorney.
Why don't you go right back from the very start? When did this kind of thought first occur to you to maybe do something like this?
Couple of months, probably.
Can you describe what your fantasy is for us, for the record?
I was just going to grab whoever, and I had some handcuffs and some duct tape. I was going to handcuff them and put the duct tape over their mouth so they couldn't scream. There's also also doll head I found on the ground a while back that I stuck some needles in. Kind of illustrates what was in my fantasy. It had like some needles in its cheeks and some nails in its eyes.
It's a form of what we call a behavioral tryout. And sometimes you see that with these individuals. They'll start mutilating dolls or something as a way of kind of living the fantasy, and that no longer is sufficient, which is why they select actual victims.
Just any person?
Yeah, well, I did kind of favor this girl a little. I had plenty of chances to get her. She'd actually been in my apartment a couple of times before that. One time I was standing out there with my pet rat, holding it and had it on my shoulder. And, you know, she thought it was cute and she wanted to pet it.
What's her name for the record?
I didn't even know it until this happened. It was Jamie Bowman or something like that.
How did you learn of her name?
Newspaper.
Well, it's kind of a weird indifference, you know? I mean, it really wasn't important to him what her name was. A lot of times, particularly with serial killers, they're looking for a type. So what does it matter what the person's name is? He found a vulnerable victim.
So, you know, she seemed like a very trusting kid. If it hadn't been me, it could have ended up being someone else.
He has been relying on the virtual world, so he may have interacted with people who had similar interests.
I'm not sure he's fully grasping how unusual, how bizarre his thinking is.
I planned, you know, to get her as she, you know, walked in from school. So I hung around waiting for her. She didn't chain her bike up, she just propped it up against the stairwell. She saw me stand there. Anyway, she, you know, kind of chatted for a minute and then asked to come inside and see my rat again. And about the only TV I ever watch is cartoons. We were talking about the show a little. And I was like, oh, now's my chance. But, you know, then I had to say, no, I can't do it. And I just kind of struggled with myself the whole time she was in there. And
it was a struggle between right and wrong.
Yeah, well, or kind of, yeah, both that and, you know, not wanting to get caught.
Some psychopaths have difficulty controlling their impulses. He, in this case, impresses as relatively immature. You know, someone who's socially sort of backward in some ways. There's a lot of impulsive behavior here, but not a lot of forethought about what the consequences would be.
I kind of thought, you know, I better just knock her out. So grabbed the cutting board, and, you know, and finally I did it. I couldn't believe how strong she was. I could barely hold her down. It took me probably 15, 20 minutes to kill her.
It shows a lack of appreciation of what he's done. He's completed the act, he's done what he's wanted to do, and then he moves on.
And he knows what he just did, and there doesn't seem to be any remorse.
I was talking to her, but I was also occasionally stepping outside, you know, helping them look for the girl. Stuff like that, kind of setting it up an alibi there, and acting like I was all concerned about her missing.
When did you first notice they were looking for her?
Pretty much right after I killed her.
I've hardly ate in 24 hours. I don't necessarily know or believe that he's actually anxious. I think he has some kind of cognitive understanding that he's going to get in trouble. So the reaction he's having is more about being apprehended. And then potentially, I may not have an opportunity to do this again.
I'm afraid the cops would come into my apartment and see all my horror.
Police say it's a criminal investigation. Foul play, a distinct possibility. Searching ponds, riverbanks, and fields, there is no sign of 8-year-old Victoria Stafford. Late last night, police released this surveillance videotape from a high school next to Victoria's school, which shows her walking away with an unknown woman.
he make you help him do that? You know what a psychopath is, Mike?
I have never met one.
I just met one tonight. You.
If she can get to a phone, if she can just get away, she's a strong, strong little girl. You know, like, just get away from whoever it is, or wherever you are, and just run.
We've been looking out for anything that could possibly help us find the identity of this person.
Come on in, grab a chair. That'll unfold, so that's a blanket for you there, okay? And if you have any questions as we go along, there's no issues there at all, okay?
Okay. I didn't do anything.
Well, that's not entirely true.
That is entirely true. I didn't do anything.
No, you can try and cement yourself into that, okay? But at the same time, you're not doing yourself any good by not being truthful, okay? And there's no surprises left anymore, okay? It's not even a surprise, it's why this happened.
I'm also not the only innocent person who's ever been arrested and charged.
I'm not sure what to make of his distress, because at times it sounds like he's trying to sound emotionally distressed. It's a weird modulation of his voice.
Other than him leaning forward in the beginning, there's no panting. There's nothing like that he's kind of in any anxiety or panic mode.
Your vehicle's seen on the video, okay? The girl who's on the video who walks away with Tori has been identified, and she's been identified as her and Tori being in your car. And you can't mask that. You can't change it, okay?
No.
Because what's happened has happened. I can't turn back the hands of time, and neither can you. This may have been a thing that you just snapped and did something. That stuff happens. It may have been something you planned for many months and got some enjoyment out of the plan.
I didn't do anything.
He is thwarting every approach they try and use to get him to own even a little bit of something that happened. He's doing that verbal play with them. It's almost a verbal repartee. He's listening very carefully, and he's also divulging, but they're not listening. So you can see that in psychopathy as well, where the person they're highly tuned to their target and to other people in their environment. So that's how they stay manipulative of other people. They try the good cop, bad cop. By trying to make him feel bad, they try empathizing with him, and he does something that you might tell any friend to do, is just ask for an attorney and shut up. But he can't shut up. He keeps talking, even though he's still not going to go for it and tell them what they want to know. But he is deliberately rejecting every opportunity they give him to confess to something or to even acknowledge something.
I think they may have underestimated the level of callousness and unemotionality and psychopathy present in their suspect.
You don't have to be an expert in body language. All you've done is lay around in the fetal position since you've been here. That's not how innocent people act. That's not how people that are falsely accused of something act. It's the last thing they do.
Possibly that it's freezing. I haven't eaten since noon. It couldn't be that this is all just a huge shock to me. No, it couldn't have been any of that at all.
You made a mistake, right? You'd take this back if you could. This is a mistake, Mike. You need to deal with this.
I am no monster.
I know
but
you're
I
not
did
a monster.
not do what you think I did.
I know you did.
He's most likely referring to his own internal world and fantasy life that he's been engaged in for a very long time. He's been doing it all in his mind and thinking about the kidnapping and abducting people. And then we find out, and they have this collection of child pornography.
He's engaging in sexual deviant behavior. He's choking women. He's having women spend their entire salaries on him. But he's been adept enough of avoiding law enforcement apprehension.
They fanned out into the fields looking for any sign of the little girl.
There's discussion, like, previous to the day of the event, with Mike saying, "Oh, would you ever kidnap somebody?" We went through a whole thing where, "Oh, you're just talk. You never do it. You just talk. You're gonna do that today. You're gonna do that today." He had made the comments about young female, so it'd be easy to manipulate.
So she's trying to portray herself as someone essentially carrying out an act really under the control, perhaps, of Mr. Rafferty.
Victoria was pretty much the first younger female that came out. Like, I was holding her hand. She was with me. She was good. Like, she was great. Like, she wasn't scared of me. She wasn't. He wanted a claw hammer, garbage bags, like a box of garbage bags. I was really contemplating, like, whether or not I wanted to go back up to the vehicle or not. The biggest reason for even going back to the vehicle was because Tori was there, and I knew at least while I was there, I could at least make it somewhat better for her.
She has a history where she was raised in a highly physically and sexually abusive environment for a very long time. And the consequences of that is very often people then crave other kinds of abusive relationships. In other words, they're unsure about their own self-worth, and they tend to attach to people who will belittle them, abuse them. She was recruited by him.
See bits and pieces, and that's it. I turned my head because I didn't want to see it. I could hear her calling my name.
Many victims of sexual assault abuse will describe that they become paralyzed when confronted with the sexual assault. At a really deep level, she is like the little girl.
Well, I think what Terry Lynn, Ms. McClintock, is trying to describe is that perhaps her co-conspirator was manipulating her or trying to convince her to carry out the subduction. One of my favorite phrases that she uses is, I didn't look all the time. No one asked her in the interviews, what do you mean all the time? Or another way you can phrase it is, tell me what you did see. Tell me what you did see. So she's trying to portray herself as someone essentially carrying out an act, not so much as a victim, but really the second person in this co-conspiracy, really under the control, perhaps, of Mr. Rafferty.
So tell me what happened. I seen Tori on the ground. I turned my head away again. I could hear her, like, the sound of her voice, like, just grow fainter. I could hear, like, moaning, like. I remember hearing the rustle of garbage bags. Like, I seemed like you kick her a couple times, like. Garbage bag over her head. Used to hammer. I see the garbage bag over, so there wasn't. Afterwards, like, this, like, there was no like blood splatter, like he knew what he was doing, like. Started to lift up her upper body, and I just stood there. And he would make it like all pissed off. Like, hurry up! Like, what are you doing? You gotta help me move her. You gotta help me move her. So I picked at the bottom where her feet were. I walked her over. Just tossed. Tossed me.
I followed the evidence. I've read the file. Okay, there's no doubt in my mind. We're past that. Okay, and the only concern or the issue that I have is why you did this.
I didn't help kill anybody.
You were there. You've heard from Terry. Okay.
Terry's saying my car is there. Terry, the drug addict who stabs people, is there, saying that I was there. And you're going based on what some girl has told you.
Minutes ago, an officer just handed me a fax report from London Police about a date rape allegation involving you. And that's only. How unfortunate for you that within 5 months you've been accused of date rape, of drugging a girl, and now you're accused of kidnapping and murdering an 8-year-old girl.
It's a liar.
Tori Stafford is all over your car. All over it. And Terry Lynn explains everything that she knows we're going to find. You're explaining nothing. So I don't give a if you say one more word, tell the truth.
Right, we're done then.
Well, I'm done with you anyway.
Someone runs in here and starts barking. I'm done.
to try to trigger someone to have an emotional response. And if they have that response, maybe the dam will break and the rivers will start flooding. You're not going to do that with someone like this. Someone who is psychopathic, you're not likely going to get that response.
Well, but the problem with that is, like you say, that's frustration of people that haven't slept great for days, right? They've all missed family engagements during that time, right?
Well, maybe then he should have a Coke and a smile and try to talk to me later.
What's your biggest fear or your biggest concern now that you've been charged with this?
Losing my life. It's not being able to have a life anymore.
There's no sympathy. It's really all self-focused. His life's over. He's going to jail, but there's no real expression of the damage that he's done to all these other lives at all.
Hey, Mike. I'm a pretty get down to the facts kind of guy. I've got what Terry Lynn has told me this afternoon, and I've got you. This is your opportunity. Terry Lynn's sitting right here. Tell her she's a liar. You've got no problem at saying without her in the room.
Terry's a liar.
That's what you're hoping.
I'm not even looking at her. I don't need to look at her.
He doesn't even look at her. She is not a person to him. I think she felt that she was a person to him based on some of her statements, but he doesn't even acknowledge really her presence when she comes in.
You know what a psychopath is, Mike?
I have never met one.
Well, I just met one tonight.
In the other room.
You. You know, psychopaths don't tell the truth. Psychopaths rarely confess, actually.
Okay.
You are a sick puppy, Michael. This is a good day for us. Because with any luck, you'll never be free again. You know, anybody but you. No remorse, no empathy, no nothing. You're just hollow.
Back there under the rocks, Detective Staff Sergeant Jim Smith found the body of Tori Stafford in a garbage bag. Michael Rafferty has pleaded not guilty to the charges of sexual assault, abduction, and murder.
It was me that committed the murder and not him. He didn't physically kill her. It wasn't him that killed her. It was me.
McClintock now says that while he raped Tori, she was the one who killed the 8-year-old.
I don't believe.
Part 1. The Hook. July 5th, 2011. Outside the courthouse in Orlando, Florida, the summer air felt heavy enough to stop breathing. Television cameras stretched across the sidewalks like rows of steel insects. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Thousands of people watched giant screens. Millions more sat in living rooms, offices, restaurants, and airport terminals across America. Everyone was waiting for the same words. For nearly 3 years, the country had followed the story of a little girl named Caylee Anthony. A child with bright eyes. A child whose smile had appeared on missing person posters, television broadcasts, and newspaper front pages from coast to coast. A child whose disappearance had transformed into one of the most controversial criminal investigations in modern American history. And now, after months of testimony, arguments, forensic evidence, accusations, and endless public debate, 12 jurors were about to deliver an answer. Or at least the closest thing to an answer the legal system could provide. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt almost unreal. No one moved more than necessary. No one spoke above a whisper. The room seemed frozen in anticipation. Then the verdict was read. Not guilty. For a brief moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that arrives before people fully understand what they have just heard. Then came disbelief. Shock. Anger. Confusion. Across the country, jaws dropped. Commentators stared at each other. Families gathered around televisions asked the same question. How? How could one of the most closely watched murder cases in America end like this? How could a child vanish, remain missing for months, be found dead near her home, and still leave behind a mystery that no jury felt certain enough to solve beyond a reasonable doubt? Those questions would echo for years. Because the Caylee Anthony case was never just a criminal investigation. It became something much larger. It became a national obsession. A story that seemed to grow darker every time a new detail emerged. A story filled with contradictions. A story where every answer appeared to create 2 new questions. At the center of it all stood a young mother. 22-year-old Caylee Anthony. To some people, she was a calculating killer who had escaped justice. To others, she was a woman judged more harshly by public opinion than by evidence. The gap between those 2 beliefs was enormous. And inside that gap lived one of the most fiercely debated mysteries of the 21st century. Long before the verdict. Long before the television crews. Long before the courtroom battles. There was only a family living in Orlando. An ordinary suburban neighborhood lined with palm trees and quiet streets. The kind of place where children rode bicycles beneath the Florida sun. The kind of place where neighbors waved to each other across driveways. The kind of place where terrible things were not supposed to happen. Yet sometime during the summer of 2008, something did happen. Something that would eventually draw international attention. Something that would leave investigators chasing a timeline filled with missing pieces. Something that would leave an entire nation arguing over the same fundamental question. What happened to Caylee Anthony? The mystery did not begin with a body. It began with an absence. A small absence. The absence of a little girl's laughter. The absence of tiny footsteps running through a house. The absence of a child who, according to those who loved her, was the center of an entire family's world. Days passed. Then weeks. And somehow, no official missing person report appeared. No frantic search. No immediate emergency response. No statewide alert. 31 days. 31 days would pass before authorities were formally told that Caylee was gone. 31 days. That number would become one of the most repeated facts in the entire case. Because for many people, it felt impossible to understand. How could a mother wait more than a month before reporting her 2-year-old daughter missing? Investigators would soon discover that this question was only the beginning. As detectives dug deeper, they encountered stories that shifted and changed. Names that seemed to lead nowhere. Explanations that collapsed under scrutiny. A mysterious babysitter. A kidnapping claim. A trail of statements that investigators struggled to verify. Each new discovery seemed to pull the case further away from clarity. Then came another detail. A vehicle. A car connected to Caylee Anthony. According to witnesses, something about it felt wrong. Not visually. Not mechanically. It was the smell. A smell people would later describe in ways that investigators could never completely ignore. The kind of detail that lingers in memory. The kind of detail that transforms suspicion into fear. By the time law enforcement intensified its search, public attention was already growing. News broadcasts began covering the disappearance daily. Missing person flyers multiplied. Speculation spread rapidly. The country watched. And then, months later, investigators made a discovery in a wooded area not far from the Anthony family home. What they found changed everything. The search for a missing child became a death investigation. The possibility of reunion disappeared. Only questions remained. Questions that forensic scientists would struggle to answer. Questions that detectives would spend years trying to piece together. Questions that lawyers would battle over in court. Questions that survive to this day. Because despite thousands of pages of reports, countless interviews, and one of the most publicized trials in American history, there remains a haunting reality at the center of this story. No one can say with complete certainty exactly how Caylee Anthony died. No witness saw her final moments. No definitive cause of death was established. No confession ever emerged. Instead, the case became a collision between evidence and uncertainty. Between suspicion and proof. Between what many people believed happened and what prosecutors could conclusively demonstrate in a courtroom. As the years passed, the story refused to disappear. Documentaries revisited it. Journalists re-examined it. Former investigators continued discussing it. Legal experts debated it. Ordinary people argued about it online, at dinner tables, and in workplaces across America. Some remained convinced that justice had failed. Others insisted the verdict reflected the legal system's requirement for certainty. The divide never truly healed. Perhaps because this case touches something deeper than law. It touches fear. The fear of not knowing. The fear that a child's death can remain shrouded in unanswered questions. The fear that even under the brightest spotlight, truth can remain frustratingly out of reach. Tonight, we return to that summer. Back to Orlando. Back to the beginning. Before the headlines. Before the courtroom. Before the verdict that shocked a nation. We return to the story of a little girl whose name became known around the world. A story filled with grief, controversy, mystery, and questions that continue to echo nearly 2 decades later. This is the Caylee Anthony case. And to understand why it became one of the most divisive true crime stories in American history, we have to start where every mystery begins. At the moment when something ordinary suddenly becomes impossible to explain. Part 2, the setting. To understand why the Caylee Anthony case would eventually grip an entire nation, we first have to step away from the courtroom. Away from the television cameras. Away from the headlines, the debates, the experts, and the arguments that would consume America for years. We have to return to Orlando, Florida, in the summer of 2008. At first glance, Orlando seemed like an unlikely place for a mystery that would become one of the most controversial criminal cases of its generation. 4 million visitors each year, the city represented vacations, amusement parks, sunshine, and escape. Families arrived carrying suitcases and cameras. Children tugged at their parents' hands, eager to visit attractions they had dreamed about for months. Bright advertisements promised happiness. The city sold memories. But like every city, Orlando existed beyond the postcards. Beyond the resorts and theme parks were neighborhoods where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. People woke up early for work. Paid mortgages. Argued over bills. Mowed their lawns on weekends. Raised children. Built routines. The Anthony family lived in one of those neighborhoods. The streets were quiet. Rows of homes sat beneath tall trees that swayed in the humid Florida breeze. During the summer months, the air felt heavy from sunrise until long after sunset. Afternoon thunderstorms appeared suddenly, dumping sheets of rain before vanishing as quickly as they arrived. The smell of wet pavement lingered in the evenings. Cicadas buzzed endlessly in the trees. Life moved slowly. Predictably. At the center of the Anthony household were 3 generations of the same family. George Anthony, his wife, Cindy Anthony, their daughter, Casey Anthony, and perhaps most importantly, 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony. From the outside, the family looked familiar. Not perfect. Not extraordinary. Simply familiar. Like countless families across America. But families are rarely as simple as they appear from the sidewalk. Behind closed doors, relationships are shaped by years of expectations, disappointments, sacrifices, arguments, and love. The Anthony family was no different. George Anthony had previously worked in law enforcement. The structure and discipline associated with that profession had influenced much of his life. Cindy Anthony worked long hours and was often described as hardworking and protective of her family. Together, they had spent years building a stable home. Casey, meanwhile, occupied a more complicated place within the family dynamic. She was young. She was a mother. And like many people in their early 20s, she was still trying to figure out who she wanted to become. Friends described different versions of Casey depending on when and where they knew her. Some saw someone outgoing and energetic. Someone who enjoyed social gatherings. Someone who could easily become the center of attention in a room. Others saw signs of instability. Moments when stories did not quite add up. Moments when reality and presentation seemed to drift apart. But long before strangers debated her character on national television, Casey was primarily known as Kaylee's mother. And Kaylee was the person around whom much of the family's world revolved. Photographs from those years capture a child frozen in moments of happiness. A toddler smiling toward the camera. Tiny hands reaching for toys. Curious eyes exploring a world that still felt enormous and new. The photographs would later become familiar to millions of people. But at the time they were simply family pictures. The kind stored on computers and shared with relatives. The kind that become more valuable with time. By 2008, Kaylee was approaching her 3rd birthday. At that age, every week seemed to bring something new. A new word. A new habit. A new favorite game. Children that young transform constantly. Parents often struggle to keep pace with the changes. One day they are learning to walk. The next they are forming sentences. Every milestone feels significant. Every memory feels worth preserving. Family members would later describe Kaylee as energetic and affectionate. A child who drew attention naturally. A child whose presence filled rooms. In many ways, she represented the emotional center of the household. And because she was so visible in the family's daily life, what happened next would eventually become even more difficult for outsiders to understand. Because when a child who occupies the center of a family's world suddenly disappears, people expect immediate panic. Immediate action. Immediate urgency. Yet the timeline of this case would soon challenge those assumptions. As June 2008 unfolded, life in Orlando continued normally. The summer heat intensified. Tourists crowded the city. Children played outside during school vacations. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that a national news story was quietly beginning to take shape. No sirens announced it. No breaking news banners appeared. No one could see the storm approaching. At the time, there was no public awareness that anything unusual had happened. No missing child alerts. No press conferences. No search parties. The world continued turning. And that absence of attention would later become one of the most important details in the entire case. Because according to the timeline that investigators would eventually establish, June 2008 marked the period during which Kaylee was last seen. Exactly what happened during those final days would become the subject of years of investigation, legal argument, and public speculation. Yet even today, some aspects remain uncertain. What is clear is that by mid-July, concern was growing within the Anthony family itself. Questions were being asked. Answers were becoming harder to obtain. And tension was rising. The family dynamic that had once functioned behind closed doors was beginning to crack under pressure. Imagine a house where uncertainty slowly accumulates. A question unanswered. Then another. Then another. At first, each explanation seems temporary, reasonable enough to accept for another day. But eventually, doubt begins to spread. The atmosphere changes. Conversations become sharper. Trust begins to weaken. That appears to be the environment that emerged during the weeks before authorities became involved. What makes the Casey Anthony case so unusual is that many criminal investigations begin with a report. Someone calls police. Someone sounds an alarm. Someone says a person is missing. This story unfolded differently. The silence came first. The alarm came later. And by the time that alarm sounded, more than a month had passed. 31 days. The number would become inseparable from the case. It appeared in news reports, court testimony, documentaries, public discussions. Again and again, people returned to the same question. What happened during those 31 days? Investigators would spend years trying to answer that question. Journalists would analyze it. Prosecutors would emphasize it. Defense attorneys would challenge assumptions surrounding it. The public would debate it endlessly. Yet during the actual summer of 2008, most people knew none of this. Neighbors continued their routines. Cars rolled through the subdivision. Mail arrived. Grass grew. Thunderstorms came and went. Life looked normal. The contrast between appearance and reality would later become one of the most haunting aspects of the story. Because somewhere within that ordinary summer existed a chain of events that would eventually lead to one of the most scrutinized criminal trials in modern American history. Months later, reporters from across the country would descend upon Orlando. Satellite trucks would line streets. Television networks would provide daily coverage. Legal analysts would dissect every development. The Anthony family home would become instantly recognizable to viewers who had never even visited Florida. But none of that had happened yet. At this stage, the story remained hidden. Contained within a single family. Contained within conversations that outsiders could not hear. Contained within questions that had not yet reached police investigators. And perhaps that is what makes this chapter of the case so unsettling. There was no dramatic beginning. No obvious turning point. No single moment when everyone realized something was wrong. Instead, concern emerged gradually. Like a shadow lengthening across a room. Almost unnoticed at first. Then impossible to ignore. Years later, people would search these early weeks for clues. They would examine photographs. Review timelines. Analyze statements. Attempt to identify the exact moment when the mystery truly began. But mysteries rarely announce themselves. Most begin quietly. Hidden within ordinary days. Hidden within familiar places. Hidden within moments that seem insignificant until viewed in hindsight. And in the summer of 2008, inside a quiet neighborhood in Orlando, a mystery was already taking shape. No one knew it yet. Not the reporters. Not the television audiences. Not the millions of people who would eventually become invested in the story. But the foundations of one of America's most controversial true crime cases had already been laid. The questions were forming. The timeline was unfolding. And somewhere beyond public view, events were moving toward a point from which there would be no return. The world simply had not caught up to them yet. Part 3. The Victim's Story. Before she became the face on a missing person poster. Before her photograph appeared on television screens across America. Before legal experts debated evidence, timelines, and unanswered questions. There was simply Kaylee. A little girl learning about the world one day at a time. A child whose life was measured not in years but in moments. Moments that seemed ordinary when they happened. Moments that would later become priceless. When people hear the name Kaylee Anthony today, they often think immediately of the mystery. The investigation. The courtroom. The controversy. But long before any of those things existed, there was a little girl who laughed, played, explored, and filled rooms with the kind of energy only young children possess. To understand the tragedy at the heart of this story, It is important to remember that Kaylee was not a symbol. She was not a headline. She was not evidence in a criminal case. She was a child. A child who had favorite toys, favorite games, favorite people. A child who woke up every morning curious about what the day might bring. Born in August of 2005, Kaylee entered a world that immediately revolved around her. As happens in many families, the arrival of a child changed everything. Schedules shifted. Conversations changed. Priorities rearranged themselves around the needs of someone too young to understand any of it. The adults in her life suddenly found themselves measuring time differently. Days became organized around naps, meals, and bedtime routines. Weeks became marked by milestones. The first smile. The first word. The first steps. The first signs of personality beginning to emerge. And Kaylee's personality appeared early. Family members would later describe her as cheerful and affectionate. A child who enjoyed attention. A child who connected easily with people. Photographs from those years reveal countless snapshots of ordinary happiness. In some images she is smiling directly at the camera. In others she seems distracted by something outside the frame. A toy. A pet. A voice calling her name. The photographs capture what every family hopes to preserve. Tiny fragments of childhood frozen in time. No one taking those pictures could have imagined that one day strangers would examine them with heartbreaking attention. Searching not for memories, but for understanding. Like many toddlers, Kaylee lived in a world that felt enormous. A backyard could become an adventure. A swimming pool could seem as vast as an ocean. A cardboard box could become a castle. Children experience reality differently. The simplest objects carry magic. The smallest discoveries feel monumental. Every day contains something new. A butterfly landing nearby. Rain hitting a window. A balloon floating toward the ceiling. To adults, these moments pass quickly. To a child, they become entire events. That was the stage of life Kaylee occupied. The stage where imagination and reality often blend together. The stage where every question leads to another. Why is the sky blue? Where does the moon go during the day? Why do birds fly? The world remained full of mysteries waiting to be explored. And perhaps that is what makes stories involving very young victims so emotionally difficult. Their lives exist almost entirely in potential. In possibilities. In futures that have not yet had a chance to unfold. Kaylee had no understanding of courtrooms. No understanding of media attention. No understanding of the national controversy that would eventually surround her name. She understood family. She understood familiar faces. She understood affection. She understood the comfort of routine. The comfort of being carried when tired. The comfort of hearing familiar voices. The comfort of knowing that adults would protect her. As investigators later reconstructed the family dynamic, one thing became increasingly clear. Kaylee occupied a central place within the Anthony household. Her grandparents were deeply involved in her life. Many observers noted the close relationship she appeared to share with family members. Photographs and videos often showed a child who seemed comfortable, playful, and engaged with the people around her. The house itself contained reminders of her presence. Children leave evidence of themselves everywhere. Small shoes near a doorway. Toys beneath furniture. Drawings attached to refrigerators. Blankets folded on couches. Tiny objects scattered through rooms. Their existence becomes woven into the environment. Adults stop noticing those details because they become part of everyday life. Only when a child is absent do those objects suddenly feel significant. A toy becomes more than a toy. A photograph becomes more than a photograph. A bedroom becomes more than a bedroom. Everything transforms into a reminder. Years later, many people would focus intensely on the adults connected to this case. Their decisions. Their statements. Their actions. Their contradictions. But at the center of every question remained Kaylee herself. The person who could no longer speak. The person whose story had to be reconstructed through memories left behind. Friends and relatives remembered simple things. The way she smiled. The way she interacted with people. The way she behaved around family members. These details might seem small compared to courtroom evidence, but they matter. Because they help restore humanity to someone who risked becoming known only through tragedy. True crime stories often face a difficult challenge. Investigations naturally focus attention on suspects, evidence, and legal battles. The victim can slowly fade into the background. Reduced to a photograph shown briefly before attention shifts elsewhere. But every investigation begins with a life. A real life. And in this case, that life belonged to a little girl who had barely begun experiencing the world. Imagine an ordinary Florida morning. Sunlight filtering through curtains. The distant sound of traffic. The smell of breakfast drifting through a house. A toddler waking up and immediately searching for familiar faces. Perhaps asking questions. Perhaps carrying a stuffed animal. Perhaps demanding attention in the way only young children can. Those moments rarely make history. Yet they are the moments families cherish most. The ordinary moments. The ones that feel endless while they are happening. The ones people later wish they could experience again. As the summer of 2008 approached, no one outside the family had reason to pay attention to Kaylee Anthony. She was one of countless children living ordinary lives across America. She did not know reporters would one day discuss her name. She did not know her photograph would appear on national broadcasts. She did not know millions of strangers would one day feel they knew her. She simply continued being a child. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire story. Children trust the world completely. They trust the people around them. They trust that tomorrow will arrive. They trust that adults understand things they do not. They move through life with a confidence that only innocence can create. That innocence is visible in every image of Kaylee. In every family photograph. In every home video later shown to the public. She appears exactly as she was. A little girl living in the present. A little girl unconcerned with the future. A little girl too young to recognize danger, uncertainty, or conflict. The public would eventually come to know many details about the investigation. The disputed evidence. The legal arguments. The competing theories. The forensic controversies. Yet none of those details can fully capture what was lost. Because what was lost was not simply a life. It was a future. Birthdays that would never arrive. School years that would never begin. Friendships that would never form. Dreams that would never develop. Experiences that would never happen. Every child carries an invisible future. A collection of possibilities stretching decades ahead. No one knows exactly who they will become. No one knows what paths they will choose. No one knows what impact they might have on the world. That uncertainty is part of what makes childhood beautiful. Everything remains possible. For Kaylee, those possibilities ended before anyone could know what they might have become. As months passed and public attention intensified, her image became increasingly familiar to audiences around the country. People who had never met her felt emotionally connected to her story. Parents saw their own children in her smile. Grandparents imagined their own grandchildren. The case stopped feeling distant. It felt personal. Perhaps because childhood itself is universal. Almost everyone remembers being a child. Almost everyone knows a child. Almost everyone understands the instinct to protect one. That shared emotional connection transformed the investigation into something larger than a local news story. People wanted answers not simply because a crime might have occurred. They wanted answers because a little girl had vanished from the world and no one seemed able to explain exactly how or why. As the investigation expanded, attention naturally shifted toward evidence and suspects. The machinery of the criminal justice system began moving. Detectives gathered information. Forensic experts examined evidence. Attorneys prepared arguments. But before we follow that path, it is worth pausing for one final moment to remember who stood at the center of it all. Not a defendant. Not a witness. Not a lawyer. Not an investigator. A child. A 2-year-old girl with bright eyes and a future still unwritten. A child whose story began in ordinary happiness. A child whose disappearance would spark one of the most famous criminal investigations in modern American history. And a child whose name would become forever linked to a question that remains deeply debated to this day. What happened to Caylee Anthony? That question would soon consume investigators. It would divide public opinion. It would shape one of the most controversial trials America had ever seen. But before there were answers, before there were accusations, before there was a courtroom, there was simply an absence. A little girl who was suddenly no longer there. And that absence was about to change everything. Part 4. The Incident. Every criminal case has a moment that investigators try to find. A point on the timeline where normal life ends and mystery begins. Sometimes that moment is obvious. A witness sees something. A camera records something. A phone call captures the final seconds before disaster. But in the Caylee Anthony case, the most important moment in the entire story exists behind a wall of uncertainty. No camera captured it. No witness clearly described it. No definitive account ever emerged. Instead, investigators would spend years attempting to reconstruct a sequence of events that appeared to dissolve whenever they got close to it. The summer of 2008 had settled over central Florida. The days were hot and bright. The afternoons often ended beneath dark clouds rolling across the horizon before thunderstorms burst open and soaked the streets. Life continued as it always had. People went to work. Children played. Neighbors carried groceries from their cars. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that one of the most scrutinized criminal investigations in America was quietly beginning. According to the timeline later presented during the investigation, June 2008 became the critical period. The period during which Caylee Anthony was last known to be alive. Years later, people would analyze dates, phone records, statements, and memories in an attempt to understand exactly what happened during those days. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the picture became. What should have been a straightforward timeline became fragmented. Different accounts emerged. Different explanations were offered. Questions multiplied faster than answers. At first, there was no public awareness that anything was wrong. No search teams. No emergency alerts. No police briefings. No frantic television appearances. The silence itself would eventually become one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. Because while the public would later learn that Caylee had not been seen for an extended period of time, that concern remained largely hidden from the outside world during those weeks. To understand why this became so significant, imagine the expectations most people have when a young child disappears. Parents call relatives. Relatives call friends. Police are contacted. Panic spreads immediately. Hours feel precious. Minutes feel important. Every passing moment increases fear. That expectation is deeply rooted in human instinct. When a small child cannot be located, urgency usually follows. Yet the timeline surrounding Caylee's disappearance did not unfold in a way that fit those expectations. As investigators later examined events, they discovered a period of roughly 31 days between the time Caylee was last known to have been seen and the time authorities were formally notified that she was missing. That fact alone would become a central focus of the investigation. It would become a central focus of media coverage. And eventually, it would become a central focus of courtroom arguments. But during those weeks, the outside world remained unaware. Somewhere within that span of time, something had changed. A child who had once occupied the center of a family's daily life was no longer present. Yet no public alarm had been raised. As questions emerged within the family, explanations were reportedly given. One of the most widely discussed involved a babysitter. According to statements that would later become part of the investigation, Casey claimed that Caylee had been with a nanny. The nanny allegedly had a connection to the child's disappearance. At first glance, the explanation appeared to offer a path toward understanding. If a babysitter existed, investigators could locate her, interview her, verify her account, trace her movements, build a timeline. But as detectives began examining the claim, problems emerged almost immediately. Addresses could not be verified. Employment details did not align with reality. Attempts to locate the individual produced nothing. The more investigators searched, the more the story seemed to collapse beneath scrutiny. Eventually, detectives concluded that the nanny described in those statements did not exist as presented. For investigators, this development was deeply troubling. When detectives investigate a missing child case, reliable information is essential. Every hour matters. Every lead matters. False information can consume precious resources and divert attention from critical evidence. As inconsistencies accumulated, concern intensified. Questions that had once seemed routine became increasingly urgent. Where was Kaylee? When had she last been seen? Who had been with her? What exactly had happened during those missing weeks? The answers remained elusive. Meanwhile, public awareness was growing. Once authorities became involved, media coverage expanded rapidly. The story possessed all the elements that capture public attention. A missing child. A confusing timeline. Conflicting accounts. An investigation filled with uncertainty. News organizations recognized immediately that people were paying attention. Each new development generated fresh headlines. Each unanswered question fueled further speculation. But behind the media coverage, detectives faced a far more difficult reality. They were attempting to investigate an event that should have generated immediate evidence weeks earlier. Instead, valuable time had already passed. Potential memories had faded. Potential physical evidence may have been altered, moved, or lost. Every investigator understands that time can become an enemy. The longer uncertainty continues, the more difficult reconstruction becomes. And in this case, uncertainty had already stretched across an entire month. As law enforcement intensified efforts, investigators began examining every available lead. Friends. Family members. Neighbors. Anyone who might provide information. Anyone who might help establish a clearer picture of the missing weeks. Interviews multiplied. Documents accumulated. Timelines expanded across whiteboards and investigative files. Yet certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. The case increasingly resembled a puzzle with missing pieces. Investigators possessed fragments, but not enough to reveal the complete image. Public fascination intensified because people sensed that something about the story felt fundamentally wrong. Even those who knew little about the evidence could recognize that major questions remained unanswered. Where had Kaylee been? Who had seen her last? Why had authorities not been contacted sooner? The absence of clear answers created a vacuum. And vacuums rarely remain empty. Speculation rushed in. Television commentators debated possibilities. Online discussions exploded. Ordinary citizens followed developments with extraordinary attention. Many people found themselves replaying the same facts repeatedly. A 2-year-old child. Missing. Weeks passing. Contradictory explanations. An investigation struggling to establish certainty. The story seemed almost impossible to comprehend. For the Anthony family, the growing scrutiny transformed private pain into public spectacle. Every statement received analysis. Every appearance generated discussion. Every inconsistency attracted attention. The case was no longer confined to investigators. The entire country was watching. Yet amid the noise, one reality remained unchanged. Kaylee was still missing. That fact stood above every theory, every argument, and every headline. A child could not be located. And investigators did not know why. As summer continued, the atmosphere surrounding the case became increasingly tense. Hope and fear existed side by side. Missing child investigations often produce moments of optimism. A possible sighting. A new lead. A fresh tip. People cling to those possibilities because the alternative is difficult to accept. At that stage, uncertainty still left room for hope. Investigators continued searching. Family members continued facing questions. The public continued following developments. But beneath everything lingered a growing concern that the answers, when they finally emerged, might be devastating. No one yet knew how devastating. No one yet knew that the investigation would soon transition from a search for a missing child into something far darker. For now, the story remained suspended between possibilities. Between hope and dread. Between absence and explanation. Between the last confirmed sightings and the truths investigators were still struggling to uncover. The critical event at the center of the case remained hidden. The exact circumstances surrounding Kaylee's disappearance remained unknown. And because they remained unknown, every subsequent development would be shaped by that uncertainty. Years later, people would continue debating what happened during those missing weeks. Some would focus on behavior. Others on forensic evidence. Others on competing theories presented in court. Yet all of those discussions trace back to this chapter. The chapter where a child vanished from ordinary life. The chapter where explanations failed to provide clarity. The chapter where investigators first realized they were confronting a mystery unlike any they had expected. And as the search intensified, another discovery was approaching. A discovery that would change the direction of the entire case. A discovery that would transform uncertainty into tragedy. A discovery waiting quietly in the Florida landscape, hidden from view, while investigators and the public searched desperately for answers. The mystery was about to become something else entirely. Part 5. The Discovery. By the end of the summer of 2008, the search for Kaylee Anthony had become one of the most closely watched missing child investigations in America. What had begun as a local case was now a national story. Television networks provided daily updates. Newspapers followed every development. Internet forums filled with theories, arguments, and speculation. Across the country, people who had never visited Orlando found themselves emotionally invested in the fate of a little girl they had never met. Yet despite the attention, despite the resources devoted to the search, despite countless tips and leads, investigators still lacked the one thing they needed most. A definitive answer. Months passed. Summer gave way to autumn. Autumn slowly approached winter. The uncertainty lingered. Every day that passed carried a painful contradiction. Hope remained possible. But hope was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. For investigators, missing child cases often exist in a race against time. The first hours matter. The first days matter. The first weeks matter. But by late 2008, this investigation had already stretched far beyond that. The timeline was no longer measured in hours. It was measured in months. And the longer the search continued, the more everyone feared what the eventual outcome might be. The Florida landscape itself seemed designed to conceal secrets. Dense vegetation covered large stretches of land. Wooded areas sat between roads and neighborhoods. Marshes, ponds, and overgrown patches of wilderness existed surprisingly close to residential communities. A location could appear insignificant from a distance while hiding details only visible to someone standing directly inside it. That reality complicated the search. Investigators examined numerous areas. Search teams followed leads. Volunteers assisted efforts. Authorities continued evaluating information as it arrived. Yet the answers remained hidden. Then, in December 2008, everything changed. The discovery occurred in a wooded area not far from the Anthony family home. The location itself was not some remote wilderness miles away from civilization. That fact would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The area existed close to ordinary life. Close to roads. Close to homes. Close to places people passed every day. And yet it had managed to keep its secret for months. When the remains were found, the investigation entered an entirely different phase. The search for a missing child was over. The death investigation had begun. For detectives, this moment carried a profound shift in focus. Missing person investigations are built around locating someone. Death investigations focus on understanding what happened. Those goals overlap, but they are not the same. Now investigators faced a different challenge. Not where is Kaylee, but what happened to Kaylee. The discovery scene presented immediate difficulties. Months had passed. Florida's climate is relentless. Heat, humidity, rain, flooding, vegetation growth. Time and environment can dramatically alter physical evidence. Every passing week changes a scene. Every storm leaves an impact. Every season reshapes the landscape. By the time investigators reached the area, many questions had become significantly harder to answer. Crime scene personnel moved carefully. Photographs were taken. Measurements recorded. Evidence documented. Every detail mattered. Every observation might eventually become significant. The remains were located in a wooded area and associated with bags that immediately drew investigative attention. Nearby, investigators also noted materials that would later become subjects of extensive forensic analysis and courtroom debate. At that moment, however, none of the future legal battles mattered. The reality confronting investigators was far more immediate. A child had been found. The outcome everyone had feared was now real. News of the discovery spread rapidly. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Reporters rushed to gather information. Across America, people who had followed the case for months absorbed the devastating development. For many observers, hope had finally ended. The possibility that Kaylee might someday be found alive disappeared. Only grief remained. Within the Anthony family, the emotional impact was immense. Whatever disagreements, suspicions, or tensions existed, the discovery represented a tragedy that could not be undone. A little girl was gone. Nothing in the legal process could change that fact. Nothing in the investigation could reverse it. The focus now shifted toward understanding. Toward accountability. Toward answers. Yet almost immediately, investigators encountered a major obstacle. The condition of the remains made determining a precise cause of death extraordinarily difficult. In many homicide cases, forensic pathology provides a clear roadmap. A specific injury. A specific mechanism. A specific explanation. Those findings can become the foundation upon which an entire prosecution is built. This case would be different. Because of the passage of time and environmental conditions, experts faced severe limitations. They could identify the remains. But identifying exactly how death occurred proved far more challenging. That uncertainty would eventually become one of the most important issues in the entire case. At the discovery scene, however, investigators could not yet see all the legal implications waiting in the future. They focused on gathering facts, collecting evidence, preserving whatever information remained. Every object recovered from the area was examined. Every detail was documented. Forensic specialists worked carefully because they understood something crucial. The scene itself might never exist again in the same condition. Once processed, photographed, and examined, the original environment would inevitably change. Their documentation had to be thorough. Their observations had to be precise. The stakes were enormous. Meanwhile, public reaction intensified. Questions multiplied almost immediately. How long had the remains been there? Could the area have been searched earlier? What evidence might still exist? What evidence had already been lost? People wanted certainty. Instead, the discovery generated a new layer of mystery. Rather than answering every question, it created additional ones. The location became the subject of extensive scrutiny. Investigators reconstructed access routes, examined environmental conditions, considered visibility issues, reviewed previous search efforts. Every aspect of the area became important. Every detail had the potential to influence the direction of the investigation. The media followed these developments relentlessly. By now, the case had become far more than a local tragedy. It had evolved into a national phenomenon. Entire programs were dedicated to analyzing evidence. Experts debated possibilities. Former investigators offered opinions. Legal commentators predicted future developments. Yet beneath the constant coverage remained a simple and heartbreaking reality. A 2-year-old child had lost her life. Everything else existed around that central fact. As forensic examinations continued, investigators attempted to determine what conclusions could be supported by evidence and which questions might never be answered definitively. That distinction would become critically important. Because criminal investigations do not operate on assumptions. They operate on proof. Evidence must withstand scrutiny. Conclusions must be supported. The stronger the allegation, the stronger the evidence required. Those principles would later shape every stage of the case. But first, investigators needed to understand what they actually possessed. The discovery scene offered clues. Not certainty. Clues. And clues require interpretation. Different investigators may see different implications. Different experts may emphasize different findings. Different attorneys may construct different narratives from the same information. That process had only just begun. As winter settled over Florida, the investigation entered a new chapter. The search was over. The mystery remained. In some ways, it had become even more complicated. The remains had been found, yet the most important questions still lacked clear answers. What exactly had happened? When had it happened? Who knew the truth? Could that truth ever be reconstructed with confidence? Those questions now moved to the center of the investigation. Detectives intensified their efforts. Forensic specialists continued their analyses. Prosecutors began evaluating evidence. The case was no longer focused on finding Kaylee. It was focused on building a timeline capable of surviving legal scrutiny. And as investigators dug deeper into witness statements, digital records, forensic evidence, and the actions of those closest to the child, they would soon find themselves navigating a maze of contradictions, disputed interpretations, and competing explanations. The discovery in the woods had answered one terrible question. Kaylee had been found. But the larger mystery remained alive. In many ways, it was only beginning. Because now investigators faced the challenge that would define the entire case. Not simply proving that a tragedy had occurred, but determining whether the available evidence could explain exactly how it happened, and who, if anyone, could be held legally responsible for it. Part 6. The Investigation. The moment Kaylee Anthony's remains were identified, the investigation entered its most intense and most complicated phase. For months, detectives had been searching for a missing child. Now they were investigating a death. At first glance, that might seem like a simple transition. It wasn't. Because while the discovery of the remains confirmed a tragic outcome, it did not automatically answer the questions investigators needed most. In some ways, it created even greater challenges. A body can tell a story. A crime scene can tell a story. Physical evidence can tell a story. But in this case, months had passed before the remains were discovered. Time had erased some answers before investigators ever had the opportunity to examine them. And so detectives found themselves confronting a difficult reality. They had a victim. They had public attention. They had enormous pressure. But they still lacked certainty. The challenge was no longer finding Kaylee. The challenge was determining exactly what had happened to her and whether the available evidence could support criminal charges. Investigators began assembling every fragment of information they could locate. Witness interviews. Phone records. Computer activity. Financial records. Photographs. Video footage. Statements given during earlier stages of the investigation. Every detail became important. Every inconsistency became significant. Every contradiction demanded explanation. The case file grew larger by the day. Entire timelines were constructed and reconstructed repeatedly. Detectives compared witness accounts against documented events. They examined movements, relationships, conversations, patterns of behavior. Nothing was considered too small. Because in complex investigations, seemingly insignificant details sometimes become critical evidence. From the beginning, one person naturally occupied the center of investigative attention. Casey Anthony, the mother of the victim. That focus was not unusual. Whenever a young child dies under unclear circumstances, investigators routinely examine those closest to the child first. Parents, guardians, caregivers, people who had regular access, people who were responsible for the child's well-being. This is standard investigative procedure. It does not imply guilt. It reflects probability. The people closest to a child generally possess the most information about that child's final known movements. As detectives reviewed Casey's statements, they encountered a recurring problem. Many claims could not be verified. Some appeared inconsistent with known facts. Others changed over time. The issue wasn't simply that investigators lacked answers. The issue was that some of the answers they received seemed unreliable. One of the most widely discussed examples involved the alleged babysitter. According to statements provided during the investigation, Kaylee had supposedly been left with a nanny. This explanation initially offered investigators a direction. Find the nanny. Verify the account. Continue from there. But as detectives pursued the lead, the trail began to unravel. The individual described could not be located. Addresses failed to produce results. Employment records did not support the claims being made. Eventually, investigators concluded that the story did not match reality. That conclusion had a profound impact. When detectives discover that a significant explanation appears false, they naturally begin questioning other information provided by the same source. Trust erodes. Verification becomes more difficult. Every statement requires additional scrutiny. Investigators now faced a troubling possibility. If key elements of the timeline were inaccurate, then reconstructing the truth would become dramatically more challenging. As the investigation expanded, another issue attracted attention. Casey's behavior during the weeks after Kaylee was last known to be alive. Witnesses described social activities, interactions with friends, public appearances, normal routines. To many observers, these reports appeared difficult to reconcile with the circumstances surrounding a missing child. The public reacted strongly. Media coverage amplified those reactions. People formed opinions quickly. Some saw the reported behavior as deeply suspicious. Others cautioned that human responses to stress and trauma vary widely. Detectives understood that behavior alone rarely proves a crime. People react differently to crisis. Some become emotional. Some become detached. Some deny reality. Some appear calm when outsiders expect panic. Behavior can raise questions. But criminal cases require evidence. Investigators therefore focused on facts they could verify. One of the most debated areas of inquiry involved a vehicle associated with Casey. Witnesses reported concerns regarding an odor detected inside the trunk. The issue quickly became a major investigative focus. Forensic testing followed. Experts examined available evidence. Analyses were conducted. Interpretations emerged. Yet almost immediately, disagreements appeared. Some experts believed certain findings supported investigative concerns. Others questioned the reliability of those conclusions. The disagreement would continue for years. What appeared straightforward to some observers became far more complicated under scientific scrutiny. And that pattern repeated itself throughout the investigation. Few pieces of evidence existed in isolation. Almost every finding generated competing interpretations. Almost every conclusion faced challenges. The deeper investigators went, the more they discovered a case built upon layers of uncertainty. Then there was the computer evidence. Investigators examined activity associated with computers used within the household. Search histories became subjects of intense analysis. Among the most discussed findings were searches involving chloroform. Prosecutors would later view these searches as potentially significant. Defense attorneys would challenge the interpretation. Experts debated timing, attribution, and context. What exactly had been searched? Who conducted the searches? What did the searches actually mean? Those questions became battlegrounds. Again, certainty remained elusive. The investigation increasingly resembled a maze. Each path appeared promising. Each path eventually led to new complications. Detectives continued interviewing witnesses. Friends described conversations. Family members described interactions. Co-workers provided information. People who knew Casey offered observations regarding her lifestyle and behavior. The resulting picture was extensive but not necessarily clear. Human memory is imperfect. People remember events differently. Two witnesses can observe the same moment and later describe it in completely different ways. Investigators had to evaluate credibility constantly. Who remembered accurately? Who was mistaken? Who might be influenced by media coverage or personal feelings? Sorting fact from perception became a major challenge. Meanwhile, public interest reached extraordinary levels. Few criminal investigations in recent memory had generated comparable attention. News programs devoted hours to discussing developments. Legal commentators appeared nightly. Online communities examined every available document. The case became a national obsession. People debated not only evidence but morality. Not only facts but perceptions. The court of public opinion was already operating long before any actual trial began. That environment created additional pressure for investigators. Every development generated headlines. Every leaked detail became a talking point. Every investigative decision faced scrutiny. Yet detectives could not build a case based on public emotion. They needed evidence capable of surviving courtroom examination. And that standard is far higher than public suspicion. As months passed, investigators gradually developed theories regarding what might have occurred. But theories alone are not enough. Every theory must be supported by evidence. Every claim must be defended against challenge. Every conclusion must withstand cross-examination. The legal system demands proof, not assumptions. This distinction would ultimately become one of the defining themes of the entire case. Because many people believed they understood what had happened. But belief and proof are not the same thing. Investigators continued working through enormous amounts of information. Digital records. Forensic findings. Witness statements. Physical evidence. Behavioral observations. Family dynamics. Nothing was ignored. The goal was simple. Build the strongest possible understanding of events. Yet the deeper they looked, the more the case seemed divided between what could be suspected and what could be demonstrated. That divide would eventually dominate the courtroom. Before that could happen, however, detectives still had work to do. Every unresolved question had to be explored. Every alternative explanation had to be examined. Every lead had to be followed. Because defense attorneys would eventually challenge every weakness. Every uncertainty. Every assumption. Investigators knew this. The stakes were enormous. A little girl was dead. The entire nation was watching. And the truth, whatever it might be, remained frustratingly difficult to establish with complete certainty. By the time prosecutors prepared to move forward, the investigation had produced mountains of material. Evidence boxes. Interview transcripts. Forensic reports. Digital analyses. Thousands upon thousands of pages. Yet hidden within all that information remained a problem that no amount of paperwork could fully solve. No witness had observed Kaylee's death. No definitive cause of death had been established. No direct evidence provided a complete account of what happened during her final moments. The investigation had generated suspicion. It had generated theories. It had generated evidence that prosecutors believed was compelling. But whether that evidence would be enough to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt was a question nobody could answer yet. And as the investigation approached its next chapter, both sides were preparing for the battle that would define the case forever. A battle fought not in wooded areas or police interview rooms, but in a courtroom. A battle where every piece of evidence would be tested, every witness challenged, every theory attacked, and where the difference between suspicion and proof would ultimately determine the outcome. Part 7. The Breakthrough. Every major investigation reaches a moment when detectives believe they finally see the outline of a story. Not necessarily the truth. Not certainty. But a narrative that appears capable of connecting scattered pieces into a coherent picture. For the investigators working the Caylee Anthony case, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It emerged gradually. One report led to another. One inconsistency pointed toward a new question. One unanswered mystery became linked to another. Over time, detectives began assembling what they believed was the strongest explanation supported by the evidence they had collected. The breakthrough was not a dramatic confession. It was not a hidden witness emerging from the shadows. It was not a surveillance recording revealing everything. Instead, it was the convergence of multiple investigative threads. Digital evidence, witness statements, forensic findings, behavioral observations, timeline reconstruction. Each piece alone appeared incomplete. Together, investigators believed they formed a pattern. Whether that pattern would ultimately withstand scrutiny in court was another matter entirely. By this stage, the case file had become enormous. Boxes of evidence filled offices. Investigators spent countless hours reviewing documents they had already reviewed dozens of times before. Sometimes a detail overlooked months earlier suddenly seemed significant. Sometimes a statement that appeared meaningless gained new importance when compared with another piece of evidence. The work was exhausting, methodical, often frustrating. But gradually detectives felt they were moving closer to understanding the events surrounding Caylee's disappearance. One of the most significant developments involved the continuing analysis of digital records. Computers have no emotions, no loyalties, no fears. Unlike human witnesses, digital systems do not forget. They simply record. Investigators examined internet activity associated with computers connected to the household. The findings became the subject of intense discussion. Certain searches drew particular attention. Among them were searches involving chloroform. To prosecutors, the existence of such searches appeared potentially important. They believed the information could contribute to a larger narrative. A narrative they were constructing piece by piece. But even at this stage, complications remained. Digital evidence often appears straightforward until experts begin examining it closely. Questions emerged. Who conducted the searches? Exactly when did they occur? Could attribution be proven conclusively? What conclusions could legitimately be drawn from the activity? The answers were not always simple. Nevertheless, investigators viewed the computer evidence as an important element within the broader picture. Another area receiving substantial attention involved the vehicle connected to Casey Anthony. The vehicle had already become one of the most debated subjects in the investigation. Forensic examinations generated reports. Experts offered opinions. Laboratory analyses attempted to determine what conclusions could be supported scientifically. Some findings appeared significant to investigators. Other findings generated disagreement among experts. Yet prosecutors believed the evidence contributed to a larger pattern. A pattern they intended to present to a jury. As detectives continued building their case, they revisited witness interviews repeatedly. People who knew Casey were questioned. Friends described conversations. Acquaintances recalled interactions. Investigators compared accounts against documented timelines. Every discrepancy mattered. Every contradiction demanded explanation. One theme appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation: the issue of false or misleading statements. Detectives believed they had encountered multiple explanations that either could not be verified or directly conflicted with established facts. The alleged babysitter remained one of the most visible examples. From an investigative perspective, this issue carried enormous significance. False information can complicate an inquiry. It can delay discovery. It can redirect resources. It can create entirely new investigative pathways that ultimately lead nowhere. As detectives assessed the growing collection of statements, they increasingly viewed certain inconsistencies as meaningful. Again, however, the distinction between suspicion and proof remained critical. Investigators could identify contradictions. They could document inaccuracies. But proving a specific criminal act required something more. The challenge facing prosecutors was becoming increasingly clear. They needed to persuade a jury not merely that inconsistencies existed. They needed to persuade a jury that those inconsistencies formed part of a criminal narrative supported by evidence. And that is a much higher standard. As months turned into years, the investigation evolved into preparation for trial. Detectives were no longer simply collecting evidence. They were evaluating how that evidence would survive legal scrutiny. Every piece of evidence faced an important question. Would a jury find it persuasive? Would experts withstand cross-examination? Would alternative explanations create reasonable doubt? Experienced investigators understand that criminal cases are not won during press conferences. They are won in courtrooms. Evidence that appears powerful in public discussion sometimes weakens under legal examination. Evidence that appears minor can become crucial when viewed within a broader context. The transition from investigation to prosecution forced everyone involved to think differently. Prosecutors reviewed the case from every angle. What was strong? What was vulnerable? What arguments would the defense make? Which witnesses would be challenged most aggressively? The answers shaped strategy. At the center of the prosecution's developing theory stood a difficult reality. No definitive cause of death had been established. That fact created a substantial obstacle. Most homicide prosecutions benefit from a clear mechanism. Jurors can understand what happened. They can visualize the sequence of events. In this case, uncertainty remained. Prosecutors therefore focused on circumstantial evidence, contradictory statements, behavioral patterns, forensic findings, digital records. The argument was not built upon a single overwhelming piece of evidence. It was built upon accumulation. A collection of facts that prosecutors believed pointed toward one conclusion. The defense viewed the same landscape very differently. They saw weaknesses, gaps, unanswered questions, alternative possibilities, and they prepared to attack every assumption. Long before the trial began, the battle lines were already forming. Investigators and prosecutors believed they had assembled a compelling case. Defense attorneys believed substantial doubt remained. Neither side intended to retreat. Meanwhile, public interest continued growing. By now, the case had become one of the most recognizable criminal investigations in America. People discussed it at work, at home, online, in restaurants, in classrooms. The story seemed unavoidable. And with every passing month, opinions hardened. Many members of the public felt they already knew what had happened. Others warned against reaching conclusions before all evidence had been examined. The divide widened. The investigation itself became a subject of debate. Some praised law enforcement efforts. Others questioned certain conclusions. Some believed the evidence pointed clearly in one direction. Others saw ambiguity. The same facts produced dramatically different interpretations depending on who was examining them. That reality would ultimately become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Because the breakthrough investigators believed they had achieved was not universally accepted. To detectives and prosecutors, the various pieces of evidence appeared to support a coherent narrative. To defense attorneys, Those same pieces often appeared incomplete, uncertain, or vulnerable to alternative explanations. Both sides prepared accordingly. As the trial approached, witnesses reviewed statements. Experts prepared testimony. Attorneys organized exhibits. Investigators anticipated cross-examination. Years of work were about to be tested publicly. The courtroom would become the arena where every conclusion faced challenge. Every expert faced scrutiny. Every assumption faced attack. And the evidence that investigators viewed as a breakthrough would finally confront the most important question of all. Could it persuade 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt? That question loomed over every preparation. Because the American criminal justice system does not ask whether a theory seems plausible. It asks whether guilt has been proven to a legally required standard. That standard is intentionally demanding, especially in cases carrying the most serious accusations. As opening statements drew closer, prosecutors felt they had assembled the strongest case possible from the available evidence. Defense attorneys believed substantial uncertainty remained. The public waited. The media prepared for extensive coverage. And at the center of everything remained the memory of a little girl whose death had transformed a local investigation into a national controversy. The breakthrough had brought investigators to the courthouse. But it had not ended the mystery. In many ways, the most consequential chapter was still ahead. Because now the evidence would leave the hands of detectives and enter the hands of a jury. And once that happened, the future of the case would no longer be determined by investigators. It would be determined by 12 ordinary citizens asked to answer one of the most difficult questions the legal system can ever confront. What can be proven? And what cannot? Part 8. The Justice. By the spring of 2011, nearly 3 years had passed since Kaylee Anthony disappeared. 3 years of investigations. 3 years of media coverage. 3 years of speculation, arguments, and unanswered questions. The case had grown far beyond Orlando. Far beyond Florida. Far beyond the people directly involved. It had become a national phenomenon. And now, at last, it was entering the phase that many believed would finally provide answers. The trial. Courthouses are strange places. On the outside, they often appear ordinary. Concrete walls. Glass doors. Security checkpoints. People moving quietly through hallways. Yet inside those buildings, entire lives can change in a matter of minutes. Freedom can disappear. Families can be shattered. Reputations can be destroyed. And sometimes, after years of investigation, a jury is asked to answer a question that no one else has been able to answer with certainty. That was the task waiting inside the courtroom. The prosecution entered the trial carrying enormous expectations. For years, the public had followed every development. Many people believed they already understood what had happened. Many expected a conviction. Many assumed the evidence would produce a clear outcome. But prosecutors understood something important. Public opinion and courtroom standards are not the same thing. Outside the courthouse, people are free to believe whatever seems most convincing. Inside the courthouse, evidence must satisfy a legal burden. And that burden is intentionally high. The prosecution's challenge was clear. They needed to persuade 12 jurors that the evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond suspicion. Not beyond possibility. Beyond reasonable doubt. That standard exists for a reason. Because criminal convictions carry enormous consequences. The more serious the accusation, the more demanding the burden of proof. As opening statements began, both sides presented dramatically different interpretations of the same case. The prosecution argued that the evidence pointed toward criminal responsibility. Their case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. The timeline. The statements investigators believed were false. The digital evidence. The forensic findings. The discovery of Kaylee's remains. Each piece formed part of a larger narrative. Prosecutors believed that when viewed together, those pieces pointed toward one conclusion. The defense approached the case from a completely different direction. Rather than trying to prove an alternative version of events with certainty, they focused on something else. Doubt. If they could demonstrate significant uncertainty, significant unanswered questions, significant weaknesses in the prosecution's narrative, then the burden of proof would not be satisfied. And in criminal law, that distinction can determine everything. The trial quickly became one of the most heavily watched courtroom proceedings in modern American history. Television networks covered developments daily. Legal analysts examined testimony in real time. Millions of people followed each witness, each argument, each revelation. The courtroom became the center of national attention. As witnesses took the stand, jurors heard details that had been discussed publicly for years. Investigators described their work. Forensic experts explained findings. Witnesses recounted conversations and observations. Each side attempted to strengthen its narrative while weakening the narrative of the opposition. The process was meticulous. Questions, answers, objections, rulings. Hours became days. Days became weeks. The prosecution focused heavily on the evidence they believed established a pattern. The delayed reporting of Kaylee's disappearance. The misleading information investigators said they encountered. The internet searches that became subjects of intense scrutiny. The evidence associated with the vehicle. The circumstances surrounding the discovery of the remains. No single element stood alone. The prosecution relied upon accumulation. Their argument was that when all pieces were viewed together, they created a compelling picture. Yet the defense was prepared. Aggressively prepared. Defense attorney Jose Baez challenged assumptions at every opportunity. Witness testimony faced cross-examination. Expert conclusions faced scrutiny. Interpretations faced alternative explanations. The defense consistently returned to a central theme. The prosecution, they argued, could not prove exactly how Kaylee died. That issue became one of the most important battlegrounds in the entire trial. In many homicide prosecutions, the cause of death provides a foundation. It allows jurors to understand what happened. It provides a framework for evaluating evidence. In this case, that framework remained uncertain. Months had passed before the remains were discovered. Environmental conditions had complicated forensic analysis. Experts could not establish a definitive cause of death. The defense emphasized this repeatedly. Again and again, jurors were reminded of what investigators did not know. Not simply what they suspected. What they knew. The distinction mattered. The defense also presented an alternative theory. They suggested that Kaylee may have died accidentally in the family's swimming pool and that events afterward had been mishandled or concealed. The theory generated intense debate. Supporters of the prosecution strongly disagreed. Many legal observers questioned aspects of the argument. Yet from a legal perspective, the defense did not necessarily need jurors to accept every detail. They needed jurors to consider whether reasonable doubt existed. That is a very different objective. As testimony continued, the emotional weight of the case remained constant. Photographs of Kaylee appeared repeatedly. The reality of her death never disappeared from the courtroom. Regardless of legal arguments, everyone understood the tragedy at the center of the proceedings. A little girl was gone. Nothing could change that. But determining legal responsibility required more than tragedy. It required proof. Throughout the trial, expert witnesses became crucial figures. Forensic specialists explained scientific findings. Technical evidence was translated into language jurors could understand. Yet expert testimony often revealed another challenge. Science does not always provide simple answers. Different experts sometimes interpreted evidence differently. Different methodologies produced different conclusions. Areas of uncertainty became visible. Those uncertainties would play an important role in jury deliberations. The longer the trial continued, the clearer the central conflict became. The prosecution argued that the totality of evidence supported guilt. The defense argued that uncertainty remained too substantial to overcome reasonable doubt. Neither side controlled all the facts. Neither side possessed complete certainty. The jury would ultimately decide which interpretation was more convincing. Weeks passed. The courtroom settled into rhythm. Witnesses entered. Witnesses departed. Evidence was presented. Arguments intensified. Outside, public interest remained extraordinary. People debated developments daily. Entire television programs were devoted to analyzing testimony. Many observers attempted to predict the verdict. Yet predictions mean little once jurors enter deliberations. Inside the jury room, media narratives disappear. Public opinion disappears. Only evidence remains. Only instructions from the court remain. Only the legal standard remains. When closing arguments finally arrived, both sides understood what was at stake. The prosecution urged jurors to examine the evidence as a whole, not as isolated fragments, but as interconnected facts forming a larger picture. The defense urged jurors to focus on uncertainty, on unanswered questions, on gaps in the prosecution's case, on the burden of proof. Then the case belonged to the jury. The waiting began. Across the country, people watched and speculated. Some felt confident. Others felt uncertain. No one outside the jury room knew what discussions were occurring. No one knew which arguments had proven persuasive. No one knew how jurors were interpreting the evidence. Then came July 5, 2011. The verdict day. The courtroom filled. Reporters prepared. Family members waited. Tension seemed to settle over every corner of the room. The jurors entered. The verdict forms were handed to the clerk. And then the words were spoken. Not guilty. Not guilty. Not guilty. The reaction was immediate. For many observers, shock arrived first. Then disbelief. Then anger. Across America, people stared at television screens struggling to process what they had heard. The public response was intense because many individuals had expected a different outcome. Yet the verdict reflected something specific. The jury was not being asked whether suspicions existed. They were not being asked whether questions remained. They were being asked whether guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And after examining months of testimony and years of investigation, the jury concluded that standard had not been met regarding the most serious charges. Casey Anthony was convicted on several counts of providing false information to law enforcement. But she was acquitted of murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter. The verdict instantly became one of the most controversial decisions in modern American legal history. Some viewed it as a failure of justice. Others viewed it as an example of the legal system functioning exactly as intended. A criminal conviction requires proof. If proof falls short of the required standard, acquittal follows. That principle remains fundamental regardless of public opinion. Days later, after receiving credit for time already served, Casey Anthony was released. The courtroom battle had ended. The legal process had reached its conclusion. But the controversy had not. In many ways, it was only beginning. Because while the justice system had delivered its verdict, the larger debate surrounding the case would continue for years. Perhaps decades. The trial answered certain legal questions. It did not answer every question people wanted answered. And that gap between legal certainty and public uncertainty would become the lasting legacy of the case. A legacy that remains alive long after the courtroom doors closed and the cameras moved on to other stories. Part 9. The Aftermath. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the questions remained. That is perhaps the strangest thing about certain criminal cases. The investigation ends. The trial ends. The verdict is delivered. The legal process reaches its conclusion. Yet the story refuses to disappear. Instead, it lingers. Quietly. Persistently. Like an unfinished sentence. Like a door left slightly open. The Casey Anthony case became one of those stories. Years after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded from front pages, people continued asking the same question they had asked from the beginning. What really happened to Kaylee Anthony? Not what was argued. Not what was suspected. Not what was believed. What happened? The legal system had provided an answer to one question. The prosecution had not proven the most serious charges beyond a reasonable doubt. That was the verdict. That was the legal conclusion. But legal conclusions and emotional conclusions are not always the same thing. For many people, uncertainty remained. And uncertainty has a remarkable ability to endure. Human beings are uncomfortable with mysteries. We want causes. We want explanations. We want events to fit neatly into narratives that make sense. When a child dies, the need for answers becomes even stronger. Because children represent possibility. They represent futures that have not yet been written. And when those futures disappear, people naturally search for meaning. The challenge is that meaning and certainty are not always available. Some cases end with confessions. Some end with overwhelming evidence. Some end with clear timelines that leave little room for debate. This was not one of those cases. Instead, the Casey Anthony case entered a strange place where legal outcomes and public opinion traveled in different directions. The divide became enormous. One side argued that the verdict represented a failure of justice. The other argued that the verdict represented the legal system operating exactly as intended. The debate continues even today. Perhaps because both positions are rooted in important truths. The death of a child is a tragedy. The burden of proof in a criminal trial is intentionally high. Those two realities can exist simultaneously. And when they collide, controversy often follows. Years passed. The media landscape changed. New criminal cases captured national attention. Other headlines replaced older ones. Yet the Casey Anthony case continued resurfacing. Documentaries revisited the evidence. Books explored the investigation. Television specials re-examined the timeline. Podcasts dedicated entire series to the mystery. A new generation encountered the story for the first time. And each time the case returned to public discussion, the same pattern emerged. People reviewed the facts. People debated interpretations. People arrived at different conclusions. Few cases have generated such long-lasting disagreement. Part of that disagreement stems from the unusual nature of the evidence. Many criminal investigations rely heavily on direct proof. A witness. A confession. A clear forensic conclusion. This case relied largely on circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is not weak by definition. In fact, many successful prosecutions depend upon it. But circumstantial cases often leave more room for competing interpretations. And competing interpretations tend to survive long after trials end. Another reason the case remains influential is because it exposed a broader misunderstanding many people have about criminal law. Movies and television often create unrealistic expectations. People assume that a jury's verdict answers every question. In reality, juries answer very specific questions. The most important one is usually simple. Has guilt been proven beyond a reasonable doubt? That standard does not require jurors to solve every mystery. It does not require them to know everything that happened. It requires them to evaluate whether the evidence satisfies a legal burden. The distinction is subtle. Yet it matters enormously. Many people looked at the Casey Anthony verdict and saw contradiction. How could so many questions exist and still result in acquittal? The answer lies in the difference between suspicion and proof. The legal system cannot convict people based solely on suspicion. No matter how strong that suspicion may appear. That principle protects everyone. It is one of the foundations of modern criminal justice. At the same time, the existence of that principle does not eliminate emotional frustration. Especially when the victim is a child. Especially when key questions remain unanswered. Especially when uncertainty persists. And uncertainty certainly persists here. Even now, years later, investigators, journalists, attorneys, and members of the public continue examining details. Timelines are revisited. Statements are reconsidered. Evidence is analyzed again and again. Yet no new development has fully resolved the mystery. The central question remains remarkably resistant to certainty. That reality can be difficult to accept. People often assume that every mystery eventually receives an answer. History suggests otherwise. Some mysteries survive generations. Not because nobody cares. Not because nobody tries. But because certain moments disappear before they can be documented. Certain truths vanish before they can be preserved. Certain events leave behind only fragments. And fragments can tell stories. But they rarely tell complete stories. Perhaps the most important thing to remember when discussing this case is the person at its center. Not the defendant. Not the attorneys. Not the investigators. Not the television personalities. Caylee Anthony. It is easy for famous criminal cases to become consumed by controversy. The debates become so loud that the victim slowly disappears from view. The arguments become the story. The headlines become the story. The courtroom becomes the story. But underneath everything lies a simple and heartbreaking reality. A little girl lost her life. A little girl who once laughed. A little girl who once played in Florida sunshine. A little girl who had favorite toys, favorite people, and a future she never had the opportunity to experience. That reality should remain at the center of any discussion. Because true crime stories are not puzzles created for entertainment. They involve real people. Real suffering. Real loss. The best true crime storytelling remembers that. It remembers that behind every case file is a human life. Behind every exhibit is a family. Behind every headline is grief. The Caylee Anthony case also serves as a reminder of the limitations of certainty. People often speak about truth as though it is always accessible. Always waiting to be discovered. But investigations do not operate in perfect conditions. Evidence disappears. Memories fade. Witnesses make mistakes. Time changes everything. Sometimes investigators reconstruct events with extraordinary precision. Sometimes they cannot. The difference is not always effort. The difference is often circumstance. In this case, circumstance played a powerful role. Time passed before authorities became involved. Environmental conditions affected evidence. Critical questions remained unresolved. Those realities shaped everything that followed. They shaped the investigation. They shaped the trial. They shaped the verdict. And they continue shaping public perception today. There is another lesson hidden inside this story. A lesson about attention. During the height of the case, millions of people watched every development. The public became deeply invested. Yet public attention can be both helpful and dangerous. It can encourage accountability. It can generate resources. It can keep important stories alive. But it can also create assumptions, pressure, expectations, narratives that become difficult to separate from facts. The Caylee Anthony case became a powerful example of that tension. Few investigations have existed under such intense public scrutiny. Few verdicts have generated such immediate reaction. And few cases have demonstrated so clearly the gap that can exist between courtroom outcomes and public belief. As we reach the end of this story, we arrive at an uncomfortable conclusion. The legal case ended. The mystery did not. Some listeners may believe they know exactly what happened. Others may believe the evidence leaves room for uncertainty. Reasonable people continue to disagree. That disagreement has survived for years. It may survive for many more. But regardless of where anyone stands, certain facts remain unchanged. Caylee Anthony existed. She was loved. She was remembered. Her life mattered. And the questions surrounding her death continue to resonate because people recognize the tragedy of a future interrupted. A childhood ended. A family forever changed. A mystery that still refuses to release its grip on public memory. Perhaps that is why the case endures. Not because of the controversy. Not because of the headlines. Not because of the courtroom drama. But because at its core lies something universally human. The desire to understand. The desire to find truth. The desire to believe that every child deserves answers. Whether those answers are ever fully known is another question entirely. And that question remains where it has always been. Waiting. Somewhere between evidence and uncertainty. Somewhere between memory and history. Somewhere in the silence left behind by a little girl whose story the world has never forgotten. And perhaps never will. Part 10, Epilogue of Silence. Time has a strange way of reshaping tragedy. At first, it arrives like a shockwave. Sudden. Loud. Impossible to ignore. Then, slowly, it fades from the surface of daily life. The headlines move on. The cameras turn away. New stories replace old ones. But in certain cases, something unusual happens. The story does not end. It simply changes form. The Casey Anthony case is one of those stories. Years after the trial ended, long after the courtroom emptied and the legal arguments stopped echoing through television studios, the case continued to exist in a quieter but more persistent space. It lived in documentaries. It lived in online discussions. It lived in conversations between people who still could not agree on what the evidence meant. And most of all, it lived in the unresolved tension between what was proven in court and what many people felt in their instincts. That tension never fully disappeared. Because it was never just about law. It was about understanding. Understanding how a child could vanish from a family without immediate alarm. Understanding how explanations could shift and collapse under investigation. Understanding how evidence could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on where one stood. Understanding how a trial could end without the kind of certainty people expected from a story that felt so emotionally overwhelming. The legal system delivered its verdict. It fulfilled its role. It applied a standard that exists to protect against wrongful conviction. Beyond a reasonable doubt is not a flexible idea. It is a threshold. A boundary. A line that must be crossed before a person can be deprived of freedom for the most serious crimes. In this case, that line was not crossed for the central charges. And so the legal outcome was final. But human understanding does not always operate within legal boundaries. People continue to ask questions even after courts stop answering them. They continue to revisit evidence even after juries have left the room. They continue to search for coherence in stories that remain fragmented. The case of Caylee Anthony became a permanent example of that instinct. A reminder that closure is not always delivered by verdicts. Sometimes, closure never fully arrives at all. For investigators and legal professionals, the case remains a study in limitation. A reminder that even extensive investigations can be constrained by time, by environment, by the absence of definitive forensic conclusions, by the complexity of human behavior, and by the legal requirement that guilt must be proven, not assumed. For the public, the case remains something else entirely. A point of debate. A source of frustration. A symbol of how justice and certainty are not always aligned. Some people see the outcome as evidence that the system failed to reach the truth. Others see it as evidence that the system upheld a principle designed to prevent irreversible error. Both interpretations persist. Neither has fully erased the other. And perhaps neither ever will. Because the deeper truth of this case is not found in a single explanation. It is found in the space between certainty and doubt. Between evidence and interpretation. Between what is known and what is believed. At the center of everything remains a life that cannot be reduced to legal language. A child who existed outside the courtroom long before she ever became part of it. Caylee Anthony was not defined by the investigation. She was not defined by the trial. She was not defined by the verdict. She was defined by her brief time in the world. A time filled with the ordinary moments that make up childhood. Moments that mattered deeply to those who knew her. Moments that should never be forgotten in the shadow of legal debates. In true crime storytelling, there is always a risk. The risk of turning tragedy into narrative structure. The risk of focusing so heavily on questions that the person at the center becomes abstract. A name. A timeline. A case file. But every case began with a human life. And every human life deserves to be remembered beyond its most tragic moment. That is especially true here. Because what makes this case endure is not just its controversy. It is its incompleteness. Its refusal to settle into a simple explanation. Its resistance to finality. Even now, years later, the core questions remain unchanged. Not because no one has tried to answer them, but because the available evidence has never fully resolved them in a way that satisfies both legal standards and human expectations at the same time. And so the story remains suspended. Not active in the way it once was. But not closed either. It exists in memory, in analysis, in debate, in reflection, and in the uneasy space where justice and uncertainty overlap. Perhaps that is why people continue returning to it. Not for answers that no longer exist, but for understanding that may never be complete. The silence surrounding the case is not empty. It is filled with interpretation, with disagreement, with reflection, and with the enduring presence of a question that refuses to fade. What happened? And how do we make sense of what cannot be fully known? In the end, the Casey Anthony case does not offer resolution in the traditional sense. It offers perspective. On evidence. On justice. On the limits of certainty. And on the fragile distance between what is proven and what is believed. And somewhere beneath all of it, beyond all arguments and analysis, there remains a simple truth that no courtroom can change. A child lived. A child was loved. And a world tried, and still tries, to understand a loss that words will never fully contain. That is where the story ends. Not with certainty, but with the quiet weight of everything that remains unanswered. And the reminder that some stories are not meant to be neatly solved. Only remembered.